Welcome to the Wealthy Retailer Podcast, everyone. My name is Dan Holman, your host for the week of February 18th. I've got my man from Road 55, Rob Lollisher, going to try to read us some headlines here.
We're going to do our best. Still chilly out, Dan. I'm getting my exercise in each morning, running out to the car, starting it, running back again. Oh, yeah. It's about all we can do now, but warmer days are coming.
That's what they say. There's warm weather on the way.
Yeah, we got some good headlines, though. I would say it seems the theme from this week is like that looking ahead, a bit of that optimism, and some great headlines here. One story about a former landscaper turned entrepreneur who really believes that once the pandemic subsides, a resurgence is in the works. Story, what waits for retail on the other side of the pandemic? I'm looking forward to your thoughts there. Story about, I love the headline in this, what independent stores can teach the mega one-stop shops, and there are definitely some great lessons in that one. And a story about an entrepreneur taking the big chance, and this is pretty cool, seeing her business double in size in 2020. And of course, every week now, we've got a retailer question for Dan, one this week about vendor scorecards and key measurables, so that should be pretty cool. You ready to go there, sir?
Let's give it a whirl.
Let's give it a whirl. Let's see what happens. Okay, the first comes from Macomb Daily. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Club Macomb. Talks about this neighborhood candy store that was really in the weeds. He was facing a lot of trouble, but seems to have got through the worst of times and is really optimistically looking ahead. What were your thoughts here, Dan?
Yeah, so this did come from Macomb Daily in Sterling Heights, Michigan, and it's the story of Pop's Sweets and Treats. So, about 2 months after closing, or nearly closing, his candy shop for good, the owner of Pop's Sweets and Treats has this renewed energy and focus. Michael Karpinski is his name, and he's got plans for growing his existing retro store on Macomb Place by leasing another 500 square foot space right around the corner with sort of a common hallway in that Pine Street area in Sterling Heights for a retail expansion. And Michael was quoted in this article as saying, you either adapt or die. Yep. And you do. In today's world, you either adapt, evolve, or die. And this 40-something-year-old, resident entrepreneur says, I don't know if it's going to work, but hey, big risks return big rewards, I hope. Now, we know hope is not a strategy, so I'm sure he's got a game plan to follow. But taking risk is what we as entrepreneurs do. And this is an example of a retailer. Rob, we've talked about this lots of times in the past. This is an example of a retailer looking for a gap in the marketplace and then taking advantage of the opportunity that the pandemic has provided him. Every retailer needs to be able to take a step back, sort of re-energize, and then ask themselves, is there opportunity I'm not taking advantage of? Where do I see my business in 3 years? And if I'm to be there, where do I need to be, in the next year?
Right.
And what from now forward actions must I take in the next 90 days to take full advantage of whatever opportunity I can uncover in this gap analysis? And that's what he's doing. He's doing gap analysis, and he's saying, hey, there's not a retro, wasn't it pinball? It was a retro, pinball.
Well, that's part of his expansion, and I thought that was pretty cool. We've talked about that lots, that experiential side of the business where, here's this candy store, and he's really eyeballing the addition of pinball games and T-shirts and merchandise, right. and sounds like he's going to have a lot of fun in that future growth.
And he's going to take, his target audience. He knows who his target audience is today, and he's going to give them more of what they're aligned with. And maybe that is, pinball, arcade games, and, haberdashery. Maybe that's what it is for him. But it's the fact that he's gone and looked for an opportunity to do something different coming out of the pandemic after, what we'll call rising from, not the burning ashes, but, a near death for his retail store.
Right. The old, what's old is new again. And
What's old is new again.
Yeah, totally. Okay, well let's keep running with that theme. On to our next story, Dan. RetailDive.com, just talks about like what's coming after the pandemic, and pulled this line out of here that their customers seem ready. There's signs of pent up demand to dine out, travel, entertainment, anything that doesn't involve televisions or digital screens. What were your thoughts from here, Dan?
Yeah, so this article written by Daphne Howard, often a good contributor to Retail Dive, one of the better sources for what's happening in the world of retail for us. And she goes on to write, for companies that run stores and sell goods, whatever was happening in retail before the pandemic has simply been sped up, disappeared, or doubled down. And making a return to normal is virtually impossible. And I completely agree with the author here, with Daphne here. If you're a retailer waiting for a return to pre-pandemic activities, I hope you're not holding your breath. Yeah. The pandemic began a retail revolution with the administered closing of retail stores. And that revolution created what we call forced evolution, the need to adapt quickly and realign activities. And this happened with the consumer first, and then retail began to respond. And so while consumers have demonstrated a greater focus on supporting the indie retailers in their communities, we as retailers need to continue up this evolutionary ladder. We cannot return to the pre-pandemic activities that saw almost 9,300 retail stores close in 2019 and 5,800 that closed in 2018. This return to what was pre-pandemic can never happen. There is no return to retail in return to normal in retail. Yep. It's just the resurgence of the sped up evolution that we're experiencing, and the opportunity that it brings for us to better connect with our audience, to be better engaged, to better serve them, to better deliver on experiential retail.
Yeah. I think a line here jumped out to me was that most profound is that retailers will be meeting a changed customer. And to your point of not looking back, because the customers are going to be so different looking ahead. What are your thoughts on that, Dan?
Well, the customer's not going to be different looking than what we see today. The customer's different looking than what we perhaps saw pre-pandemic. And there is that legacy customer that's still going to shop the way he or she always did. But the bulk of your audience has evolved. They're sourcing goods. Remember, we talk about the consumer's buying phase, their systematic buying phase. They begin with dreaming and move to exploring, selecting, and enjoying. And dreaming has taken on new activity of late, but so has exploring and selections. And so the consumer has evolved far faster than retailers have evolved. And as I alluded to, the consumer evolved before retail did. Retail simply responded to an evolving customer. All these retailers out there that think they were, the spearheaders to curbside pickup and, omni-channel, that was what your customer demanded. And it was a way for you to satisfy her needs. So you responded to the revolution that was created or administered by a greater power than me, in closing your stores, and you responded by better serving your customer in the way that she now was or is shopping. And coming out of the pandemic, let's fast forward 6 months, it's going to be a very comfortable blend of old and new. The legacy customer still wanting that one-to-one human touch and the convenience of click to pick, click and pick, click and buy, curbside pickup. And we're going to have to do a better job of inviting them into our stores to experience what it's like to be a customer in, Rob Lolly's store.
Come on down to Rob Lolly's store. Our new pinball machines are coming in this week. Well, you talk about that evolution, Dan, and just a reminder to everyone, like so much has changed the dynamics of how you operate your business, and I think this is a great opportunity to really evaluate some of the systems that you have, and remember the good folks at Canadian Retail Solutions. whether it's that, that omni-channel approach, getting on e-commerce, the integration, there's a lot of moving parts, but this is their job, folks. So be sure to check them out today. Visit retailbycrs.com. They've got the latest point of sale software, merchandise intelligence, open to buy plans. Like I said, they will get you into that e-commerce platform, and away you go. Okay, sir, our next story. Like I say, I like this headline, just, picking out that one part, what independent stores can teach the mega one-stop shops. This part here jumped out, Dan. It talks about, a lot of stores have experienced tough times recently, yet indies have been working almost the hardest to set themselves apart. The assumption, particularly within the quarantine and lockdowns, was that small independent stores were doomed. And while some stores were indeed no longer in business, others have really emerged with great strength. What are your thoughts here, Dan?
Well, this article by Russell Rath, who's a regular contributor to Forbes, writes a story about the Barnes & Noble's chief executive officer, James Daunt. And he's leaving behind this strategy that decades ago made it, the book-selling behemoth that Barnes & Noble was. And instead of focusing on maximizing economies of scale, which, in furniture, in apparel, multi-door apparel, multi-door furniture, we're buying 6 of, 7 of, 10 of, 20 of, 30 of, and spreading it across the field. He's taking this independent approach, and he's empowering his individual store managers, to curate their shelves based on local tastes. And in doing so, he's letting go of those who supervised large groups of stores and firing nearly half the company's New York-based book buyers, who once kind of decided on every title that was put on the shelf. This is an example of corporate retail empowering a local store to mimic the independent retailer to a better, more personal engagement. And we know more engagement equals more market share. And this is when we talk about the shift, Rob, that's happening at that corporate level. We're seeing it with lots of big retailers curating smaller Keurig model or boutique model stores. Yep. They're trying to mimic the personal service that the indie retailer excels at. And everyone always wants to know, how do you compete with big box? How do we survive against the big bad chains? It's the personal service that's how you survive. It's making that personal connection, the ability to engage personally with your audience. And here's Barnes & Noble saying, wait a minute, we understand why the indie retailer's having success right now, and some of us are floundering. Yeah. It's about them making this personal connection. And this story kind of highlighted that. And I love the fact, that they're stepping back and again, once again, this has happened more than once in the last decade. They're trying to mimic the prowess of the indie retailer. And that's how they're going to get stronger.
Pretty cool. When I look at this story, Dan, I came from the world of newspapers and media where, very similar in nature, where the corporate let's get one person to write the story for across the country and it'll be efficient. And then you wake up one morning and there's no community impact at all from that story. And what we're seeing happen in media is these doors opening for these micro verticals within the communities who become, community champions and can carve out a little media business for themselves, and no different on the retail side, where you wake up one morning and saying doing it this one way in 500 markets the exact same way just does not work anymore. It doesn't resonate with the audience. So yeah, I love that story. Okay, a lot of this, today's podcast is that theme of looking ahead and taking challenges head on. I love this story out of entrepreneur.com, talking about this entrepreneur who, was quick in the headline to say aha moments are a dime a dozen. It's who's taking that big chance, who's plowing ahead to get it done. Dan, some pretty cool things here, especially when she talks about doubling the size of her business in 2020 of all years. What were your thoughts?
Yeah. So in this article, it talks about Steph Clymer, who is the founder, this entrepreneurial powerhouse. I'm going to call her a powerhouse that details the pivot. So the article really does detail, asks her questions. It's a good Q&A article. And in the article, Steph details the pivots that's transformed her retail business. This is a 40-year-old mom of 3, and like I say, a retail entrepreneurial powerhouse. She opened her first maternity store in 2006 called Expecting, and 10 years later in 2016, she rebranded to Shop Common Thread. So Shop Common Thread is now the brand that she sells under. And when asked why she changed, she said, "We no longer sold maternity clothing, and I could not stand to hear one more woman ask, 'Isn't that store for pregnant women?'" And a lot of us are going to go through this as we shift our assortments. And this is what happens in a store when you start to steer your assortment. You pick a label, a brand that is tied exclusively to one vertical. You're faced with this exact same challenge that Steph was. She no longer sold maternity clothing, and Expecting sort of broadcast a message of we're for, pregnant moms. And that wasn't the case. And so after that rebrand, to get away from Expecting and onto Common Thread, they started to gain significant market share. They outgrew their existing space, and in 2019, she signed a lease on the space next door. And in January 2020, like a few of us, opened and literally doubled her business in size to begin 2020. So you're open in January, and March you close, and you have to quickly pivot and realign. And in that, since that, fatal 2 months, that wasn't fatal for Steph, in that 2-month period that was, virtual lockdown everywhere for them, they found another business, they found another gap, another opportunity, and rented a warehouse and created a brand called Heart and Twine, and it's a custom gift business. And so I'm going to encourage everybody, we'll share a copy of this article, a link to this Q&A article from entrepreneur.com in our podcast, in our newsletter.
Yeah.
You got to click on it and read these great stories. We can be inspired. And what I loved most about this article really wasn't the pivot or the growth or the success, but rather how she defined the word entrepreneur. She defines an entrepreneur as someone who dares greatly, someone who sees opportunity and then takes action. Entrepreneurs take risks and sometimes fall or fail in a big way, but we learn from the experience and then try again. Entrepreneurs are vulnerable leaders, visionaries, dreamers, and hustlers. And this is just way to go, Steph. Really, really well done. Loved this story. And even her definition, we're vulnerable, we're visionaries, we take everything to task, we dream, and we hustle. That's entrepreneurialism.
Do you a big part of that entrepreneur side, that, removing that fear and just being ready to take a chance, but taking that chance knowing that, okay, this might fail, but I'll dust off and keep going again. You seen that lot, Dan, or is that something you'd like to see more of with the retailers that you work with?
I want to see more of it. I have seen lots of it, been there, done that myself, failed at lots of things. But it's our fear, not fear of failure, it is pending failure that makes us re-examine over and over and over again, re-envision, redevelop, iterate over and over and over again. And I'm not ever afraid to fail, not especially now after having failed more than once.
Yeah.
You know what the recovery looks like. You know how to climb back to the top of your barrel. You know how to overcome it, and you learn from every single setback. And we see it lots of times in retail. I mean, look at Target. Target, what a great example in Canada of failing in a big, big way. Not really understanding. Now, are they ever going to come back? Probably not. Probably not. But it was a good example of, for everyone else on the sideline to learn from that failure. Which, as entrepreneurs, we're always watching what's going on. We're always interested in the happening, what's happening. And you've got to take, let's go back to the first article at Pops. If you want big rewards, you got to take big risks. You got to be prepared to put it on the line to get a reward.
Right on. Right on. Okay, our next part, Dan, we're having some fun with this. Couple weeks now in our third round of retailer questions for Dan, and more importantly, this isn't questions, this is answers, the Q&A part. So, Dan, take us away.
It's funny, we started this a few weeks ago, and yesterday when I went to pull a question for the podcast, there was lots to choose from.
Nice.
So I took the first one that came in after last week's podcast. And it was from Kathy in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Hi Dan, she writes, on one of your recent podcasts, you were talking about vendor scorecards and the key measurables for vendors. What are the top 3 measures I should be reviewing with them? Also, can you share your vendor scorecard with me? So, yes, I did share the vendor scorecard.
Okay.
Happy to share it with anyone. Send an email to dan@thewealthyretailer.com, and I'll give you a copy of what I feel like is a pretty good scorecard that we curated together with one of our retail superstars, Bob Zeckel with Cloud9 Pajamas.
Awesome. Yeah.
So let's talk about the scorecard. Let's start by really defining what the scorecard is. The scorecard in your business is a quantifiable document used to objectively measure a vendor's performance as well as their current or immediate ability to aid in the growth of your store and the realization of your vision. We also use that scorecard to compare vendor against vendor. So I say against like it's a negative, but I lay all of my vendor scorecards on the table. And the exercise that I go through often uncovers hidden gems in your vendor lineup. The 2 most critical things, Kathy asked for 3, and I gave her the actual scorecard and all of them. But there's not really 3 that I believe are ultra critical. There are 2. They are the 2 metrics: cash margin and efficiency or categorical sell-through. So we're going to talk about sell-through a little differently than what you might learn in Retail 101 school. So let's start with cash margin. Cash margin is the measure of sales and cost of purchase. Too often we measure performance using cost of goods sold, which simply measures the cost of a single item sold, rather than our entire investment at the vendor and category level. Cash margin are the dollars generated from sales to operate your store. It takes into account what you bought from the vendor, not what you sold from what you bought, if you can dig through that little bit. Cash margin are the dollars that we generate beyond the sale to operate our store. So a quick example, if I have a $100 sale and I bought $80 worth of entire categorical inventory from that vendor, my cost of purchase is 80%. I'm only catering or giving $20 back to operate my business. This is a true cash measure instead of the age-old cost of goods sold, which really only reflects the cost of a single item, not your entire investment. So a bit misleading when we start to think about this. So cash margin, number 1, most important metric at the categorical and vendor level, or vendor and categorical level. Number 2 is what we call efficiency or categorical sell-through. Efficiency is the measure of how quickly we turn inventory, your investment, entire investment with that inventory, with that vendor, back into cash. And quite simply, your seasonal or annual net sales divided by your total purchases with that vendor. Your target should be 75 to 85%. And thinking about sell-through, it's not, how well I sell through a line of t-shirts, how well I sell through an item. It's looking at the investment that you made with the vendor in its entirety and says, how quickly was I able to turn that back into cash? Not turn as in inventory turn, but sell through that investment and realize the cash efficiency from that. And so just review, cash margin, ideally cash margins between 48 and 54% in your store. Net sales and cost of purchase give you that percentage. Efficiency, net sales divided by total purchases can give you that categorical sell-through, and your target there has got to be 75 to 85. Less than that, you're holding on to too much inventory too long. More than that, you're probably spinning through inventory too fast, and we maybe want to slow down, hold a little more, and capture more market share, i.e. more sales. There's lots of other factors that should be used when we're measuring vendor performance, like the relationship I have with the vendor, their communication or our communication back and forth, their accommodation of requests, reasonable requests, how they are able to accommodate that, on-time delivery, terms, markdown dollars, co-op advertising dollars, whether or not they're growth focused. Now, we take that scorecard and we quantify every single area, giving each measure a number that gives me a total score that makes it very easy for me to compare vendor over vendor. The last thing I'm going to say about vendor scorecards, the one number you're never going to see on my scorecard is annual sales volume. The reason I never include annual sales volume is because this number is dictated by the buying team in your business and is of no relevance to the vendor directly or the vendor performance directly. Too often we're misled by sales volume rather than focusing on the net cash generated as compared to all other vendors in the store.
Interesting. Dan, what's your can you give us a bit of the timing of these scorecards? That how often should retailers be going through this exercise? What can you offer with that?
Yeah, so good question. Really good question, Rob. You should score your vendor a minimum of 2 times a year. And I say minimum of 2 times because we typically go and meet with a vendor in person or, this year virtually twice a year. And I want to do that homework before I go and sit down with that vendor. And I want, listen, Bob, what a great example at Cloud9. He shares the scorecard with the vendor, a blank copy, and says, please score yourself on all of these areas and send it back. And let's see how we view each other in this. And then you score me on the same things. Yep. Am I doing what I should be doing as a retailer? And this analysis allows us to get bigger, better, and stronger and create better win-win relationships. And so at minimum, I need to score my vendor twice a year. And I choose when I'm going to do it. Ideally, probably right now, maybe February, beginning of February, end of January, before I go do fall buying. And then again, in July before I go and do spring buying. And then be aligned with that timeline that allows me to share that information with my vendor. It also, like I said, if you laid down 5 scorecards, regardless of sales volume, one vendor is going to reign supreme. And you might find that they're not your biggest vendor. They are a hidden gem. They have really good cash margin. They're going to give you some markdown and co-op dollars to help you advertise the product and to cleanse through at end of season. Markdown dollars are something that every vendor is well aware of and prepared to give you if you ask.
Is Bob one of the few who does that exercise of here's the blank document? I would love to see version 1.0 versus maybe like the fifth or sixth version of it, to see all of a sudden what would be total alignment, you would hope, at that point.
I think that you're going to find every single retail consultant, every single retail coach is advocating for the same thing. Let's measure our vendors appropriately. And everyone's going to have some version of a vendor scorecard that they're promoting. You know, you should be using a vendor scorecard. And everyone should be using a vendor scorecard. And the people that aren't are misled. Misled, Rob. Misled. Yeah. And, you know, here I got into a little bit of a debate with somebody, you know, in Western United States. You know, I think it was maybe Ribkoff Sales, you know, me talking about, you know, buyer beware. Stop being forced into heavy preseason orders. Really examine your performance. And this is part of examining the vendor performance. And we need to do a better job of analyzing that vendor's performance versus listening to their, you know, rules or their ideal. You got to hold inventory for 6 months. Well, if you do, you're on a slow dying train, right? You've got to look to the vendors that are fostering growth in the business, that understand the power of turn. Vendors need to produce less more often, and buyers need to buy less more often. And until we come together on that, you're going to have some not so great scorecards.
I really enjoyed, like, just the full dynamic of the scorecard, you know, not just of course the sales components, how important, but
right,
the relationship side of it, the communication, and you know, I would assume that those are the things that, as you're looking ahead, this is where you really can build some momentum with a really strong scorecard, not just in a couple key categories, and like you said, find those gems.
Yeah, and that communication, Rob, is one of the most critical factors in the vendor relationship. If you only ever hear from them when it's time to place an order, and they only hear from you when it's time to place an order, is that really a relationship? I mean, that's a 1 on my scorecard in communication. It needs to be regular, engaging conversation that helps move the business forward. Or that is idea generation. Vendors have great examples, you know, of best practices that it's out there, that's happening out there in the field.
Awesome.
Needs to be a source of inspiration for you.
Great question, Kathy. Okay, Dan.
Yeah, really
there's got to be some other good questions out there. How do folks get them to you?
So 2 things. If you want a copy of that vendor scorecard, just send an email to dan@thewealthyretailer.com, and I'll send you a copy of the scorecard. No crazy stuff. Just here's the scorecard. Happy retailing. And if you have a question that you want to throw in the mix, I promise you'll get an instant response. You'll get a response from me very quickly. Perhaps instant is a bit exaggerative, but you'll get an immediate response from me, personal response on answering the question. Of course, we'll throw it in the bin here and answer them on the podcast. Every week, we're going to do one of these retailer questions. So fire that question off to dan@thewealthyretailer.com. We'll always include this stuff in the weekly newsletter that we send out. So be sure to join us over on retailbycrs.com and subscribe to that weekly newsletter.
Right on. As Dan said, we'll have the links to the stories we chatted about today, as well as a few extras. We've got one here. Story about concessions. What are they? And why are retailers so interested in them? You'll see that story. We've chatted a lot about this, but here's another one. 5 creative ways malls are repurposing their space. And a story about I like this, just the retail industry seeing this entrepreneurial boom from the under 25 segment, and they're really running with it. And one last story, Shopify Shop Pay expands to Facebook and Instagram. Good stuff here, Dan. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
Always a good week of stories. I'm loving the direction of, let's find some really fun, inspirational stories. And, when appropriate, we'll pull out the bad news too.
But stay with us, folks. Join us next week for all the good stories and more. And I'd say this, I challenge each of you. I bet the working together versus competition. I bet you there's a retailer out there that would benefit from listening to this each week, and we'd love it if you could share it with them. So, yeah, great week as always, and thanks very much.